Emma, Chloe, and Mia were the kind of friends who made every moment feel like an adventure. The trio had grown up together in the small, quiet town of Fairhaven, a place where excitement was hard to come by. They loved pushing each other to try new things, harmless dares that added a spark to their otherwise mundane lives. One cold autumn evening, after a late-night horror movie marathon at Emma's house, the girls decided to walk home. The streets were dark and empty, the kind of eerie stillness that made every sound seem louder. As they passed the old, decrepit house at the end of Willow Lane, Chloe stopped abruptly. "Guys, what about a dare?" she said, her voice laced with mischief. "Let's go inside the creepy house." Mia shivered and shook her head. "Are you crazy? That place is disgusting and it's probably dangerous." Emma hesitated but didn't want to seem like a coward. "We could just peek inside, take a selfie or something. It's not like anyone lives there anymore." Chloe grinned. "Exactly. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Unbeknownst to them, the house wasn't abandoned. Its occupant, a reclusive man named Victor, watched from a second-floor window as the girls debated. When they finally stepped onto the porch, his lips curled into a sinister smile. The girls pushed the creaky door open and stepped into the dark foyer. Dust motes swirled in the faint beam of Emma's phone flashlight. The house was as unsettling inside as it was outside. Old, mismatched furniture was scattered around, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. "Let's just take a picture and leave," Maya whispered, clutching Emma's arm. Chloe, emboldened by the other's nervousness, laughed. "Relax, it's just an old house." The trio moved cautiously through the main floor, the floorboards groaning under their weight. In the corner of the living room was a small wooden table with a strange assortment of objects: a rusty pocket watch, a pair of broken glasses, and an old doll missing an eye. Mia stared at the doll, an uneasy feeling creeping over her. "We've seen enough. Let's go," Mia urged. But before they could turn back, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the house, and all three girls screamed. From the shadows, a tall man emerged. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and unblinking. He wore a threadbare coat, and his hands were calloused and dirty. He said nothing as he blocked the doorway, his silence more terrifying than any threat. Emma tried to step forward. "We didn't mean to." He raised a hand to silence her, his head tilting slightly as if he were observing them like prey. "You wanted to come in," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Now you'll stay." Panic surged through the girls as he lunged at them. They scattered, running in different directions, but the house was a maze of locked doors and hidden rooms. Victor moved with terrifying precision, knowing every inch of the house. One by one, he captured them. The girls woke up in a dark, damp basement. Their wrists and ankles were bound, and a single flickering bulb illuminated the room. Chains hung from the walls, and the smell of rust and decay was overwhelming. Emma, Chloe, and Mia were huddled together, trembling. "What does he want with us?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Chloe, who always seemed so brave, was uncharacteristically quiet. "I don't know," she muttered, staring blankly at the ground. Victor descended the stairs, carrying a tray with 3 glasses of water and a loaf of bread. He set it down on the floor, his movements eerily calm. "You wanted adventure," he said, looking at Chloe. "I'll give you adventure." For days, the girls endured Victor's twisted sense of control. He toyed with them, feeding them just enough to keep them alive while playing psychological games. The once bold Chloe began to crumble, her bravado replaced by silent tears. Mia, the most timid, clung to Emma, who tried to stay strong for both of them. Emma, ever observant, began to study Victor's routines. He was methodical, always locking the basement door and checking the chains. But he had moments of carelessness. She noticed a loose bolt on her chain and began working at it with a shard of metal she'd found on the floor. It took days, but she finally managed to free herself. "I'm going to get help," Emma whispered to Mia and Chloe one night. "I'll come back for you, I promise." Chloe shook her head. "Don't leave us. What if he catches you?" "We don't have a choice," Emma said firmly. "I'll come back. Trust me." Late one night when Victor was upstairs, Emma made her move. She slipped out of her chains and crept up the basement stairs. The door creaked loudly, and she froze, holding her breath. When no footsteps followed, she continued, her heart pounding. The main floor was as dark and foreboding as ever. Emma avoided the creaky floorboards, her eyes darting to every shadow. She found the front door, but it was locked with a heavy deadbolt. Desperation surged as she searched for the key. A loud crash from the basement sent chills down her spine. Victor had discovered her absence. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and prepared herself. When Victor burst into the room, she swung with all her strength, striking him in the head. He staggered but didn't fall. Emma ran for the back door, finding it unlocked. She bolted into the night, the cold air stinging her face as she sprinted down the street. Behind her, she heard Victor's enraged shouts growing fainter as she ran. Emma flagged down a car, collapsing as the driver stopped to help her. The police were called, and she led them back to the house. But by the time they arrived, it was empty. Victor was gone, and so were Chloe and Mia. The basement was cleared out, leaving no trace of the nightmare she had endured. Emma's survival became a story of resilience, but the guilt of leaving her friends behind haunted her. She moved away, unable to face the memories that lingered in Fairhaven. Every night, she replayed the moment she escaped, wondering if she could have done more to save her friends. And somewhere, Victor prepared his house for his next visitors, waiting for the next group to dare step inside. In the sleepy town of Blackridge, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, Norman Griggs was an anomaly. He kept to himself, never attended town events, and avoided small talk. His house was the last on Maple Street, near the edge of the woods, and it stood like a monument to decay. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, and windows that always seemed to glare out, daring anyone to come closer. Children whispered stories about him. Some said he was a ghost, others swore he ate stray animals. Adults dismissed these tales, but often crossed the street to avoid passing his home. Over the past year, however, Norman became more than just a curiosity. He became the town's unspoken suspect. 5 young girls ranging from 8 to 14 had disappeared without a trace, and the police had no leads. Rumors began swirling, fueled by Norman's strange behavior. The nocturnal walks into the woods, the heavy padlocked basement door, and the faint but distinct smell of decay that seemed to emanate from his property. Blackridge wasn't the kind of place where crime happened. It was a town of bake sales, soccer games, and neighborly waves. The disappearances shattered that illusion, casting a shadow of fear over the community. Parents no longer let their children play outside unattended, and every stranger was scrutinized. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up, patrolling the streets at night, but no one dared approach Norman Griggs. The police had visited him multiple times, but without evidence, they couldn't act. Norman, always polite but unnervingly calm, let them search his home each time. They found nothing, just piles of junk, old furniture, and a basement he insisted was for storage and off-limits due to mold. Still, the town wasn't convinced. His alibis were shaky, and his cold, detached demeanor only fueled their suspicions. One person, however, wasn't content to wait for the police to connect the dots. Sarah Miller, a newcomer to Blackridge, had a knack for finding stories where others saw dead ends. A freelance journalist with a history of uncovering small-town scandals, she sensed there was more to Norman than met the eye. Sarah started with the public records. She learned that Norman had lived in the house his entire life. His parents, Mary and Gerald Griggs, had been well known in Blackridge, though not for good reasons. Gerald was rumored to have been abusive, and Mary was a recluse who rarely left the house. Both had died in a house fire when Norman was 16, leaving him the sole survivor. The fire was ruled accidental, but whispers about Norman's involvement had lingered. As Sarah dug deeper, she discovered other unsettling details. Norman had been fired from his job as a groundskeeper at the local cemetery for unprofessional behavior, though the records were vague. His few interactions with townsfolk over the years often ended with him retreating into his shell after uncomfortable silences or cryptic remarks. But what intrigued Sarah most were Norman's nightly trips into the woods. Through careful observation, she noted that he always left around the same time, carrying a flashlight and a heavy-looking bag. One night, she decided to follow him. The forest behind Norman's house was dense and sprawling, a labyrinth of towering trees and tangled underbrush. Sarah trailed him from a safe distance, her flashlight off, relying on the moonlight and his bobbing beam to guide her. He moved with purpose, as if following a well-worn path, until he reached a small clearing. From her hiding spot, Sarah watched as Norman knelt and began digging with his bare hands. After a few minutes, he pulled something from the ground, a small box. He opened it, examined its contents, then reburied it. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to decipher what she had just witnessed. Was he hiding evidence? Burying keepsakes of his victims? She decided she needed to know more. The following night, when Norman disappeared into the woods again, Sarah made her move. Dressed in black and armed with a flashlight and lock-picking tools, she crept onto his property. The house was as eerie inside as it was outside. The air was thick with dust, and every creak of the floorboards sounded deafening. She moved quickly, searching for anything that could tie Norman to the missing girls. Her attention was drawn to the basement door. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine, a heavy steel door with a shiny new padlock. Heart pounding, Sarah knelt and began working on the lock. It took longer than she expected, but eventually the mechanism clicked open. The basement was dark and cold, the air tinged with an unmistakable metallic smell. As Sarah descended the stairs, her flashlight illuminated a scene that would haunt her forever. The walls were lined with photographs of the missing girls, some taken from newspapers, others clearly candid. Beneath each photo was a shelf with small items, bracelets, hair clips, even shoes. In the center of the room stood a large table covered in dark stains, surrounded by medical tools that looked more suited for a butcher than a surgeon. A series of cages lined the far wall, each one outfitted with a small mattress and a bucket. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she noticed movement in one of the cages. A young girl, no older than 10, stared back at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. She was gagged and bound, her clothes dirty and torn. "Shh," Sarah whispered as she rushed to the cage. She fumbled with the lock but managed to free the girl. "We're getting out of here." As they turned to leave, a floorboard creaked above them. Norman was back. Panic surged through Sarah as she and the girl hurried up the stairs, trying to stay silent. They reached the main floor, but before they could make it to the door, Norman appeared, his face twisted in rage. In his hand was a rusted axe. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled, blocking their path. Sarah pushed the girl behind her, holding up a wrench she had grabbed from the basement. "It's over, Norman. The police are coming." Norman lunged at her, the axe swinging wildly. Sarah dodged, striking him with the wrench. The blow stunned him, but didn't stop him. The struggle was chaotic, the sound of metal against wood and their grunts of exertion filling the house. Finally, Sarah landed a desperate blow to his head, sending him crashing to the floor. Sarah and the girl ran to the nearest neighbor's house, screaming for help. The police arrived within minutes and arrested Norman, who was unconscious but alive. The evidence in the basement was damning, and Norman quickly confessed to the kidnappings. Of the 5 missing girls, only 2 were found alive. Norman's trial became a media sensation, and his house was condemned and later demolished. But for the residents of Blackridge, the scars ran deep. Many moved away, unable to forget the horrors that had been hiding in plain sight. As for Sarah, she wrote a harrowing expose on the case, but the fame brought her little comfort. She left Blackridge shortly after the trial, haunted by the memories of that basement and the evil that had lurked so close to home. The land where Norman's house once stood remains empty, overgrown with weeds. On certain nights, locals claim to hear faint cries coming from the darkness, a chilling reminder of the nightmare that unfolded in their quiet town. Lily Harper was 17 when her world was torn apart. She was the kind of girl whose laughter was infectious and whose energy seemed endless. On the night she disappeared, she was walking home from her best friend Emma's house after a late study session. The streets of her small town felt safe, familiar. She was only a block from her house when a van pulled up beside her, and everything went black. When Lily woke up, she was in a cold, windowless room. Her hands were tied, her mouth gagged, and her head throbbed from the blow that had knocked her unconscious. The walls were concrete, damp with condensation, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Screaming wouldn't help. She had to think. The man who held her captive called himself Richard. He was tall, with wiry gray hair and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. He didn't yell or rage. His tone was eerily calm, almost gentle, which made his actions all the more terrifying. Richard had rules. She was to speak only when spoken to, eat the meals he brought her, and never ever try to escape. He kept her locked in the small room most of the time, but occasionally he would allow her into the main part of the house. It was always under strict supervision. Richard's home was as unsettling as he was, filled with old, mismatched furniture, dusty knickknacks, and windows covered with thick blackout curtains. The air was heavy, as if the house itself bore the weight of his crimes. Lily quickly learned that Richard was a creature of habit. He woke up at 6 a.m. sharp, brought her breakfast at 7, and left the house for several hours each afternoon. When he returned, he spent the evening tinkering with tools in the basement or watching old VHS tapes in his living room. The house was equipped with locks, alarms, and cameras, making escape seem impossible. But Lily also noticed cracks in his routines. Richard was meticulous but not infallible. Sometimes he left tools lying around. Occasionally, he forgot to reset the alarm system. Lily began cataloging every detail, filing away information that could one day help her escape. One day, Richard left the basement door slightly ajar while he was distracted. Lily caught a glimpse of what lay below, a room filled with tools, chains, and items that made her stomach churn. But among the horrors, she saw a toolbox and a spool of wire, things she might be able to use. She began formulating a plan, one that relied on timing, luck, and her own ingenuity. To keep Richard off guard, Lily played the role of the compliant captive. She answered his questions politely, pretended to eat the food he brought her, and avoided eye contact. Inside, however, her resolve was hardening. She would not let him win. Lily's opportunity came on a stormy night. The power had been flickering all evening, and Richard was preoccupied with resetting the alarms. When he brought her dinner, she pretended to feel unwell, clutching her stomach and groaning. Concerned but cautious, he stepped closer. That's when she acted. Lily had managed to hide a loose piece of metal she'd pried from her bed frame days earlier. As Richard leaned in, she struck him hard across the temple. He stumbled backward, dazed but not unconscious. Panicking, she grabbed the plate from her dinner tray and smashed it over his head, buying herself a few precious seconds. Lily bolted out of the room, her bare feet pounding against the cold concrete floor. She sprinted to the basement, grabbing the toolbox she'd seen earlier. Among the tools, she found a pair of wire cutters. She raced to the front door, knowing the alarm system would go off if she didn't disable it. Her hands trembled as she cut the wires, praying she was severing the right ones. The alarm silenced, but the storm outside masked her escape. Rain poured as she ran into the night, the cold mud sucking at her feet. Behind her, she heard Richard yelling, his voice cutting through the rain. He was chasing her. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but Lily didn't hesitate. She plunged into the trees, using the storm to her advantage. She darted between trunks, doubling back to confuse him. The rain soaked her to the bone, but it also muffled her movements. Richard's shouts grew fainter as she pressed on, her lungs burning and her legs screaming for rest. Finally, she emerged onto a desolate road. For a moment, she thought she was alone, but then she saw headlights in the distance. She waved her arms frantically, collapsing as the car screeched to a halt. A middle-aged couple jumped out, their faces pale with shock when they saw her bruised, bloodied form. The police were called and Lily was rushed to the hospital. Her story shocked the nation. A brave teenager who had outsmarted her captor and escaped against all odds. The evidence Lily provided led authorities to Richard's house, where they uncovered a chilling history of previous victims. He was arrested and later confessed to multiple kidnappings and murders, but his reign of terror was finally over. Lily's recovery was long and arduous. The physical wounds healed faster than the psychological ones, but she refused to let her trauma define her. She began speaking out about her experience, raising awareness about the dangers of abduction and the importance of resilience. Her story became a beacon of hope for others who had endured similar horrors. Though the scars remained, Lily reclaimed her life. She went on to become a counselor, dedicating her career to helping others find their strength. And every time she looked in the mirror, she reminded herself of the girl who had refused to give up, a survivor in every sense of the word.